The sky was an iron sheet, thick with ash and clouded memory. Ruins stretched across what once had been downtown Chicago, now only a skeleton of its former glory. Cars lay overturned like dead insects, their horns long silenced. Trees stood like scorched sentinels, blackened by fires that had burned out weeks ago. And in the middle of it all, beneath a crumbling overpass, a lone man breathed. Barely. Kalen Gray sat with his back pressed to a cracked concrete pillar, eyes scanning the horizon like a soldier who had forgotten what peace looked like. He was in his early 30s, though he looked 10 years older now. His beard was patchy, the result of a dull hunting knife and no patience. His eyes were sunken from hunger, but still sharp, searching, waiting. Every breath he took felt like an act of rebellion. The infection, the collapse, as survivors called it, had started 273 days ago. Patient Zero was a child, someone's daughter, bitten by a neighbor's dog in an alley. That's what the news had said before the stations went dead. The virus didn't just rot flesh, it stripped away everything human, leaving behind twitching, violent husks that fed on heat, sound, blood. They weren't dead. That was the worst part. Kalen had seen their eyes, still human, still terrified, trapped behind something monstrous. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a ragged sleeve and listened. Silence. But silence didn't mean safety. The infected had grown, clever. Or maybe just less stupid. Either way, they didn't scream anymore. They waited, stalked, hunted. Kalen rose slowly and slipped the revolver from his hip holster. Only 3 bullets left. He didn't even have the luxury of fear anymore. Just caution. His next stop was a gas station 2 blocks east. Word on the shortwave, when it still buzzed with life, was that there were a few safe zones out west. Maybe Colorado. Maybe lies. But you couldn't survive this long without hope, even the fragile kind. As he made his way down the shattered street, Kalen's boots crunched over broken glass and dried blood. He passed a child's stuffed rabbit lying half-melted in the gutter. A note was pinned to its chest in red marker, "We waited for you, Daddy." He looked away quickly, jaw clenched. There were too many ghosts in this city. He rounded the corner near the gas station and froze. Movement. A figure stood near the entrance, back turned. Ragged clothing, long tangled hair, pale arms. It wasn't twitching. It wasn't snarling. It was humming. Kalen crouched and aimed his revolver, his finger trembling over the trigger. But something felt off. The infected didn't hum. They couldn't. Could they? The figure shifted and he caught a glimpse of her profile. A young woman, maybe late 20s. Human. He lowered the gun slowly and stepped out, clearing his throat just loud enough to get her attention. Her head snapped around, eyes wide with terror, and she raised a jagged piece of rebar like a spear. "Whoa, hey," Kalen said, hands raised. "Not one of them." She didn't lower the weapon. "Prove it." He thought for a second. "If I was infected, you'd already be screaming." Silence. Then, reluctantly, she eased the rebar down. "My name's Kalen," he said. "Been on my own for weeks." "You?" Her voice cracked. "Tess." She glanced over her shoulder. "They've been around here lately. I saw one tear through a group of 5 last night. Didn't even slow down." Kalen nodded grimly. "They're getting faster." She gave a bitter laugh. "Yeah. Lucky us." The two scavenged what they could from the gas station, some canned beans, a couple bottles of water, a half-smashed pack of cigarettes. Tess insisted on checking the back office, where Kalen found a dusty map with red circles marked across the Midwest. One of the circles was in Colorado. Fort Garland. He tapped it silently. "You think it's still there?" Tess asked. "I don't know," he replied. "But we've got nowhere else." As they left, dusk began to bleed across the sky. Kalen scanned the rooftops. The city was too quiet. Then he heard it. Not a snarl. Not a scream. A whistle. High, slow, deliberate. 3 notes. Almost melodic. Tess froze. That's not one of them. Kalen pulled her down behind a parked van, his blood turning to ice. No. It's worse. In the distance, a shadow moved, tall, broad, too coordinated to be infected. There were others out there. Not all of them were monsters. But some were far worse. The sound of the whistle lingered in the air, sharp and haunting, like the memory of a song long forgotten. Kalen's hand instinctively tightened around the revolver as he scanned the streets. The shadows, already stretching long from the dying light of the sun, seemed to shift, twisting in unnatural ways. Every corner, every alley, could hide the source of that whistle. Tess pressed herself flat against the van, her breath shallow. What was that? Kalen didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted across the block, weighing his options. There was no way they could outrun whatever was out there, if it was even something they should try to outrun. I don't know, Kalen muttered, voice low. But we need to move. Now. He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. Tess was still frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She had been on her own for a long time, but she'd never heard that sound. Neither had Kalen. They moved quickly, keeping close to the walls, ducking behind anything that could offer them even the slightest bit of cover. Kalen's heart raced in his chest, a pulse of adrenaline, a frantic rhythm that matched his footsteps. They reached the alley that ran parallel to the gas station, a narrow passage that led to a network of abandoned stores. Kalen motioned for Tess to follow as he slipped into the shadowed corridor, the darkness swallowing them whole. Every sense was heightened. His ears strained for any sounds beyond their own breathing, the scrape of shoes on pavement, the occasional gust of wind that shifted debris, the distant hum of forgotten city machinery. Nothing else. Nothing but the echoes of that whistle. Tess's voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse. Do you think it was a person? Another survivor? I don't know, Kalen said, his tone flat. He had learned not to trust anyone too quickly in this new world. Trust had become a rare commodity. If it was, they're either crazy, or they're part of something worse. Tess flinched. She wanted to say something, to ask more questions, but she didn't. They both knew better than to waste words. Every second spent talking was a second lost. They moved through the alley, crouching low as they neared the intersection with the next block. A storefront loomed ahead, dark and broken, its glass windows shattered by whatever had passed through this place long before they arrived. It was a perfect hiding spot. But Kalen didn't stop. Stay close, he warned, his voice barely a murmur. They reached the end of the alley. Ahead of them, a shadow moved. A human figure. The whistling began again, those same 3 notes, slower now, like a warning. It came from the figure, who stood motionless in the street, facing them. Kalen's grip tightened on the revolver. Don't move, he hissed at Tess, but she was already pressing herself against the crumbling wall of the alley, her chest rising and falling quickly. Kalen's heart beat faster. He couldn't take any chances. The figure stepped into the faint light of the street lamp, and Kalen froze. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothing, his face obscured by a dark hood and a scarf wrapped around his neck. He was tall, too tall, and moved with the eerie, methodical precision of someone who was used to surviving in this nightmare. Kalen's eyes flicked to the side. Tess was trembling. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. The whistle was the only communication needed between them. It was a signal, a message. But Kalen couldn't decipher it. He knew one thing for certain, whoever this was, they weren't scared. They didn't move like they were running from danger. They moved like they were in control. Kalen's mind raced. He had been alone for so long, long enough to forget what normal people acted like. He had seen survivors, sure, but it was always chaos. Always fear. Always distrust. This man, though, he was something else. Who are you? Kalen called out, his voice low but firm. The man didn't respond. He tilted his head, as if considering Kalen's question. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice soft but cutting through the night like a blade. "We don't have time for questions, friend." Before Kalen could react, the man raised his hand in a sudden, fluid motion. A bright flash of metal gleamed in the darkness, an old military rifle, a weapon Kalen hadn't seen in months. It was pointed straight at him, the barrel steady, unflinching. "I'm not here to fight you," the man continued, his tone almost too calm. "But you're in my territory now." Territory? The world around them felt smaller suddenly, suffocating. Kalen didn't lower the revolver, but he didn't raise it either. This wasn't a confrontation he could win with a single shot. Tessa's breathing grew louder behind him, and he could feel her fear pressing against his back. But something else was pulling at his attention, an instinct that he hadn't felt since the days before the collapse. Something in the man's voice, the way he held the rifle with ease, the way he stood as if the world still made sense, made Kalen hesitate. "Why are you here?" Kalen asked again, the words forced through clenched teeth. The man smiled, slowly, almost as if amused. "I was wondering when you'd ask." He lowered the rifle, but just a little. "Let's talk," he said. "But don't think for a second you're leaving this place without an answer." Kalen felt the weight of that statement settle in his chest. The game had changed. The man lowered the rifle but didn't fully relax his stance. His eyes never left Kalen, calculating, sharp, like a predator watching its prey just before making the kill. Kalen, for the first time in a long while, felt his stomach knot. This wasn't a simple encounter, this was something else, something dangerous. Tessa's breathing quickened behind him, but Kalen didn't turn. He couldn't afford to. Not now. He was too aware of the rifle still in the stranger's hands, the way his fingers curled just slightly around the trigger. "So, what's the deal?" Kalen asked, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. He had lived through months of danger, but this felt different. This man was in control. "You gotta camp somewhere? Or are you just passing through?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, the tip of his boot scraping against the cracked pavement. Tess flinched, and Kalen's grip tightened on his revolver, but he didn't raise it. "Not yet." "We're not passing through," the man finally said, his voice like gravel. "This place, it's ours now." Kalen felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Yours?" The man nodded once, sharply. "I lead a group. Not a big one, but enough to hold our own. We've carved out a place in this hellhole where we can survive. But it comes with a price." The way he said price made Kalen's skin crawl. He could hear the unspoken threat in the man's tone, an undercurrent of warning that cut through the words like a knife. Tess, unable to hold herself back any longer, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What's the price? What do you want from us?" The man's gaze flickered to her for the briefest moment, then back to Kalen. "It's simple. You live here, you contribute. You bring what you can. Food, medicine, weapons, people. If you can't, then you leave. No one gets to stay unless they earn their place." Kalen's eyes narrowed. "And if we don't agree to your little deal?" A smile, barely a twitch, formed on the man's lips. It was thin, cold, and utterly void of warmth. "Then you leave. Or you don't. Your choice." Kalen could feel Tessa's unease radiating off her like heat. She was still looking at the man with suspicion, her hand gripping the rebar she had taken from the gas station, but Kalen knew that it wasn't enough. Not against a man who carried that rifle with such ease. "So what do we do now?" Kalen asked, keeping his voice level despite the tightness in his chest. His mind was racing, trying to figure out if this was a trap, if there was any escape route. He was a survivor, but survival in this world had become a game of constant calculation. "You'll come with me," the man said simply, his voice like ice. "You've got no choice in that. But you can decide how it goes after that. We'll take you to our place, and then you make your decision. Stick around or keep walking. But no one goes through these streets without being part of the system." Not anymore. Kalen glanced at Tess, who was still tense, but nodding slightly in understanding. She knew as well as he did that staying here, alone in the city, would be a death sentence. And while this man was dangerous, he offered something far more valuable than just shelter. He offered information, a chance to get closer to the rumors of Fort Garland, to find out if the safe zone out west was real or just another piece of wishful thinking. We don't have much, Kalen said, eyeing the man cautiously. Just what we could scrounge up. Food, some supplies. The man's expression didn't change. Doesn't matter. We'll take it. And we'll take you. Tess opened her mouth as if to argue, but Kalen raised a hand to stop her. They didn't have time for protests. He knew the cost of hesitation in a world like this. Every minute they spent debating could be their last. Fine, Kalen said, his voice firm. We'll come with you. The man gave a satisfied nod, lowering the rifle even further, though he kept it within reach. Good. Follow me. He turned sharply, moving with a fluid grace that reminded Kalen of a predator, calm, methodical, yet always dangerous. They followed him through the wreckage of the city, keeping their distance but never too far behind. The streets were eerily quiet as they walked, the once thriving city now a graveyard of human ambition. Buildings loomed like tombstones, shattered glass glistening in the dimming light. As they turned down another street, Kalen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was the subtle shift of the air, the way the shadows clung to the alleyways like sentient things, waiting to spring. So who else is with you? Kalen asked, his voice low, trying to break the silence. The man didn't answer right away. It wasn't until they reached a crumbling apartment complex that he spoke again. A few families. Some who've learned how to fight, some who haven't. We take care of our own. But if you're weak, you're dead. Kalen's stomach churned at the bluntness of the statement. In this new world, survival wasn't just a matter of food or shelter, it was a matter of being strong enough to stay alive. They entered the building, and the air felt heavy with tension. The soft, muffled sounds of people moving inside, the scrape of furniture, the murmur of voices, hinted at a larger community. A community that had learned, the hard way, to survive at any cost. Kalen and Tess were led to a room on the second floor, where a few people were gathered, sitting around a table with maps, scavenged radios, and other signs of a makeshift command center. The leader's eyes flickered over them briefly before returning to the map. Well, the man said, his voice dripping with casual amusement. Looks like we've got new guests. The room was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The smell of stale air and something burnt lingered, a reminder that even in the so-called safety of these walls, the world outside still crept in, unforgiving, relentless. Kalen and Tess stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the room. A handful of people, maybe 5 or 6, sat around a makeshift table cluttered with supplies. A woman with short, gray hair and an eye patch was marking something on a map, her fingers moving quickly. A man in his 40s, wearing a leather jacket, sharpened a knife, his gaze flicking between the blade and Kalen. The rest were younger, their faces hardened, resigned to the harshness of their existence. The leader stepped into the room, still holding his rifle. He glanced at the others, giving them a single, imperceptible nod, and then turned to Kalen and Tess. Welcome, he said flatly. I'm Rael. This is our home. For now. At least. The woman with the eye patch stood up, offering a firm handshake. I'm Margot. You two have any experience with taking care of things? Kalen didn't hesitate. We've managed. Whatever comes our way. Margot's lips twitched into something between a smile and a sneer. That's good to hear. Here, survival isn't just about fighting. It's about doing what's necessary. Tess shifted uncomfortably beside Kalen. Rael gave her a sharp look, but didn't comment. Instead, he motioned to the table. Sit down. Let's talk. Kalen hesitated but sat. Tess followed his lead. They'd come this far, and there was no turning back now. Rael paced slowly in front of them, his hands resting casually on the rifle slung across his back. The world we once knew is gone. We're not here to rebuild it, we're here to survive it. Every decision we make, every move, has consequences. There's no room for weakness. I don't think we're weak, Kalen said, his voice firm. Rail stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. It's not about what you think. It's about what you can prove. This isn't some charity. You don't get to stay just because you're alive. You want to be a part of this group? You'll have to earn it. All of it. Tessa's eyes darted to the others in the room. None of them spoke, though the tension was palpable. The air was thick with unspoken rules, things no one would outright say but that everyone knew. If they wanted to stay, they had to pay their dues. Rail gestured to the young man who had been sharpening the knife. Troy, show them. Troy didn't look up. He just stood, the knife gleaming in his hand, and walked toward the door. What's going on? Tess asked, her voice tight. Don't worry, Rail said, his voice almost too calm. You'll see. They followed Troy out the door, into the hallway, and down the stairs to the street below. The sounds of the city felt louder now, more oppressive, more alive in a way that made the hairs on the back of Kalen's neck stand on end. But there was no time to focus on that. Troy led them to an old garage behind the building, the door rusted shut but still barely functional. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and gasoline, and a small group of people were gathered in a tight circle. A fire pit in the center of the room flickered with light, casting strange shadows on the walls. On the floor, tied to a chair, was one of the infected. It was an old man, his skin stretched taut against his bones, his mouth agape in that terrifying, eternal snarl. His eyes were vacant, but there was still something human in them. They weren't dead, not in the way people used to think of the word. But they were far from alive, too. Kalen's stomach lurched. He had seen infected before, but never this up close, not when they were tied and helpless. There was something about it that felt wrong, something that felt like an unspoken line had been crossed. Rail's voice broke the silence. We don't kill them right away. Not unless we have to. They can be useful. Kalen's eyes darted between the infected man and Rail. Useful? Troy stepped forward, slamming a metal rod against the concrete floor. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. The infected man's head snapped up, eyes wide with that primal, predatory hunger. His body twitched in the chair, straining against the ropes that bound him, but he couldn't move. Not anymore. Rail's gaze remained steady, watching the infected's every movement. This one's been here for weeks. We use them to test things, foods, supplies. If they eat it and survive, we know it's safe. If they don't, he let the sentence hang in the air. Tess recoiled, her face twisting in disgust. You're using them as guinea pigs? Rail didn't flinch. It's survival. You do what you have to do. We can't afford to waste resources, not when the world's like this. If you're going to live here, you'll learn to make hard decisions. Kalen felt a cold knot in his stomach. He had heard rumors of things like this happening, people treating the infected like tools, like commodities. But seeing it in person, hearing the casual indifference in Rail's voice, made it all too real. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was something darker. Now, are you going to prove you can survive? Rail asked, his voice cold, challenging. Kalen and Tess exchanged a look. There was no going back now. They could leave, of course. But they had nowhere to go. And survival meant making choices, sometimes the kind that tore at the edges of humanity itself. Tess finally spoke, her voice strained but determined. What do we need to do? Rail's lips curled into a thin smile. We've got a supply run coming up. You'll join us. Prove your worth. The following morning, the air was thick with tension as Kalen and Tess prepared for the supply run. The faint light of dawn filtered through the broken windows of the building, casting long shadows across the cracked floor. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint sounds of people moving around, preparing for the day's work. Rail, ever the shadow, was already at the front, checking his rifle with a practiced hand. Margot stood beside him, her one eye scanning the room, her demeanor sharp and alert. Troy was polishing a blade, his gaze flickering between the others like a predator sizing up his next move. Kaelin glanced at Tess, her face pale, the weight of what they were about to do hanging heavy between them. He could see the worry in her eyes, the same uncertainty that gnawed at him. But there was no choice. The infected had already shown them the price of being weak. They needed Rael and his group, if for nothing else, then for the chance at something more than the never-ending fight for survival. Rael turned to face them, his cold eyes narrowing slightly. "Ready?" he asked, his voice blunt. Tess nodded but said nothing, clearly still shaken by what they had witnessed the night before. Kaelin, for his part, just gave a tight nod. He wasn't sure what they would find on this supply run, but he had learned long ago not to expect mercy in this world. Only results. "Good," Rael said, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so unsettling. "We'll be heading out through the back exit. Keep your heads down and your eyes open. We don't know what's out there today." As they filed out of the building, the streets greeted them with their usual silence. The city was a skeleton, its once bustling roads now empty and desolate. Broken buildings lined the streets, their windows shattered like teeth fallen from a dying mouth. The wind carried the distant echoes of a world that no longer existed. Rael led the way, moving with purpose as if the wasteland outside had long since stopped intimidating him. He knew these streets. Kaelin could tell. He moved like someone who had staked his claim and wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. The group moved in a tight formation, walking swiftly but cautiously. They didn't talk much, only the occasional whisper exchanged between Rael and Margot. Kaelin and Tess stayed at the back, scanning the street for any signs of movement. It didn't take long before the silence of the city began to feel suffocating, like the walls were closing in. Every alley they passed, every corner they turned, felt like it could hide something, someone, waiting. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the city, where the crumbled remains of what used to be a warehouse district lay. The sky above was clouded, but there was a strange stillness to the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rael motioned for the group to stop. He surveyed the area, eyes darting from one side of the street to the other, clearly scanning for any signs of danger. After a few tense moments, he nodded. "This is where we make our move," Rael said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of caution. "We've got a stash of supplies inside one of these warehouses. Food, meds, some fuel. All the essentials." The group moved toward one of the larger buildings, its entrance blocked by a rusted metal gate. Rael was quick to work, pulling a crowbar from his pack and forcing the gate open with a sharp screech of metal. Inside, the warehouse was even darker than the streets outside. The shelves that once held inventory now stood empty, save for a few crates in the corner. Dust hung thick in the air, settling on everything. The place had been scavenged before, but Rael seemed confident there was still something useful left. Kaelin was wary. His fingers tightened around his revolver as he scanned the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to move. "Check the crates," Rael ordered, his voice echoing in the large, empty space. "Start with the one in the back." The group spread out, working in silence as they went to work. Kaelin moved cautiously toward the crates, staying close to Tess. She was quieter than usual, her eyes darting nervously around the space. As Kaelin pried open one of the crates, the smell of canned food hit him, a brief moment of relief in a world that had long forgotten comfort. But even as he sorted through the supplies, his sense of unease deepened. Something didn't feel right. The sound came suddenly, a faint scrape of metal against concrete. Then another. This time louder. Tess stiffened, her hand flying to the rebar she had kept with her. Rael's voice rang out, commanding and sharp. "Get down!" The room exploded into chaos. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the warehouse, a gaunt, wild-eyed man, covered in dirt and ragged clothes. He was holding something, a crowbar, like Rael's, but it was dripping with something darker. Blood. Before Kaelin could react, the man charged forward with a scream, a guttural sound that echoed off the warehouse walls. Troy lunged toward him, but the man was too quick. He swung the crowbar with wild abandon, knocking Troy back against one of the shelves with a sickening crack. "Ambush!" Rail shouted. "Get them!" The group scattered, pulling weapons from their packs as the man, or whatever he was, continued his mad assault. Kalen's heart hammered in his chest as he ducked behind a crate, his hand instinctively going for his revolver. Tess was already beside him, her eyes wide with panic. "Stay low," Kalen ordered, trying to steady his breath. From the chaos, another figure appeared, emerging from a side door, another scavenger, more armed than the first. And then another. The warehouse was no longer a safe haven, it had become a trap. Tessa's voice trembled as she grabbed his arm. "What's happening? Who are they?" Kalen didn't have time to answer. He shoved her behind the nearest stack of crates just as the first scavenger charged at him, swinging his crowbar wildly. Kalen barely managed to dodge the blow, his heart racing. "We need to get out of here," Kalen shouted, but the moment he looked up, the exit was blocked. The scavengers were everywhere now, and escape wasn't an option. Rail's voice rang out again, and Kalen heard the distinct sound of gunfire. The others were fighting back, but the odds were shifting. The price of survival was higher than ever. The chaos in the warehouse seemed to multiply with every passing second. Screams echoed off the concrete walls, and the unmistakable sound of metal meeting flesh rang out in the distance. The scavengers were everywhere now, their eyes wild with desperation and hunger, each one wielding a weapon like it was their last chance at survival. Tess was pressed up against one of the crates, her breath coming in shallow gasps, eyes wide with fear. Kalen's hand was still gripping the handle of his revolver, his knuckles white, though he hadn't yet pulled the trigger. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The scavenger who had charged at them was now on the ground, blood staining the concrete in a thick pool. Rail had been quick to react, his rifle cracking with precise shots. He wasn't wasting time, his movements were fluid, practiced. But even he seemed on edge, his eyes darting from one enemy to another. Troy, who had taken the first hit from the crowbar, was back on his feet, though his face was pale with pain. He clutched his side, but the anger in his eyes burned brighter than the pain. He moved with an intensity that Kalen hadn't expected, attacking with brutal efficiency. Kalen didn't hesitate any longer. He fired. The first shot rang out, hitting one of the scavengers square in the chest. The man fell with a heavy thud, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Stay down," Kalen shouted to Tess, but she was already moving, her eyes locked on the action in front of them. She wasn't scared anymore, she was angry. Rail barked an order, and the rest of the group responded quickly, pushing back the scavengers with well-aimed shots and vicious strikes. It was clear this wasn't the first fight they had seen, but Kalen couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The scavengers weren't acting like desperate survivors, they were rabid, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for something. "What the hell is going on?" Kalen muttered under his breath, scanning the room. He caught Margot's eye from across the warehouse. She was crouched behind a large barrel, her rifle aimed at the remaining scavengers, but her face was tight with suspicion, a furrow between her brows that Kalen knew wasn't just the strain of the fight. Something didn't feel right. Another scavenger appeared from the shadows, this time more cautious, his eyes flickering nervously between Rail and the others. He had the same wild, desperate look in his eyes as the others, but he wasn't charging this time. He was calculating, waiting. Before anyone could react, he raised his weapon, a crossbow, and fired. The bolt flew across the room, embedding itself into the crate beside Kalen with a sharp, metallic thud. Kalen barely had time to duck as the scavenger prepared to reload. "Take cover!" Rail shouted, and the group scattered again, seeking the shelter of whatever they could find. Tess grabbed Kalen's arm, pulling him toward a stack of crates further into the warehouse. Her fingers were trembling, but her grip was tight. She was scared, no, terrified, but not of the scavengers. She was scared of something else, something deeper. "What's going on, Kalen?" she asked, her voice shaky but urgent. "Why are they acting like this? Why are they hunting us?" Kalen didn't have an answer. He didn't know. But the way they were fighting, the way they had moved in so quickly, he had a sinking feeling that this was more than just a random group of desperate survivors. "It doesn't make sense," Kalen muttered, pressing his back against the crate as he reloaded his revolver. "They're not just scavengers. They're organized." A loud crash sounded from the far end of the warehouse, followed by a flurry of movement. Kalen's heart raced as he looked up, expecting to see more of the scavengers coming for them. But what he saw made his blood run cold. One of the scavengers, a woman, was dragging someone into the warehouse. It was another of their own, but she wasn't struggling. She was bound. "Rail!" Margot shouted from across the room, her voice cutting through the noise. "They've got one of ours." Rail's face twisted with anger. Without a word, he sprinted toward the woman, but before he could reach her, the scavenger turned, her hand shooting out with a knife that gleamed in the dim light. She aimed for Rail's throat. Time seemed to slow. Kalen's instincts kicked in, his revolver in hand before he even realized what he was doing. He fired. The shot echoed in the vastness of the warehouse, and the woman crumpled to the ground, her knife clattering uselessly to the floor. Rail stood frozen for a moment, staring at the body in front of him, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "Damn it," Rail muttered, his eyes dark with frustration. "That was one of my people." But Kalen wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the figure who had been dragged in, another survivor, one of Rail's group, bloodied and broken, her hands tied behind her back. She looked disoriented, her hair matted with dirt and blood, but when her eyes met Kalen's, he saw something more than just fear. He saw recognition. "Kalen," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent. "It's a trap." Before he could process her words, Rail was at her side, yanking her up roughly. "What the hell do you mean, a trap?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The woman's eyes darted around the room, a look of panic crossing her face as she tried to speak, but before she could, there was another sound, something louder this time. The door to the warehouse slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room went still. From the shadows at the far end of the building, more figures emerged, dozens of them, all armed, all wearing the same vacant look. Kalen's heart stopped. They weren't just survivors. They were a group. A well-coordinated group. And they were coming for them. The tension in the warehouse thickened as the shadows grew longer. Kalen's breath hitched in his chest, his eyes locked on the approaching figures, more scavengers, but they weren't like the ones they had fought before. These were different. They moved with purpose, not the frantic desperation of those who had been left to fend for themselves. No, these were organized, cold, and calculating. Rail's hand tightened around his rifle as the figures advanced. Margot, already low to the ground, was shifting her weight to prepare for a shot. Troy was on the far side, grimacing with pain but still moving with deadly focus, as though every step took him closer to the end of the world he knew. "Who are they?" Tess asked, her voice trembling. Her hand was still gripped tightly around the rebar, knuckles white with fear. "They're not scavengers," Kalen replied, his voice strained. "They're them, people who think they own what's left of the world." The woman who had warned them, the one Rail had pulled to safety, was shaking now, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something darker, something familiar. She was mumbling to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "They've been tracking us," she said. "All of us. Ever since we set up camp. They've been watching." Kalen's stomach churned. His mind was racing. Rail's group had already made enemies, but this was more than he had bargained for. Whoever these people were, they had an agenda. And now, Rail's team was in the crosshairs. "Get ready," Rail barked, breaking Kalen's concentration. His cold, unfeeling eyes turned to his team, a fleeting moment of hesitation flashing across his face. "This is it. No more running." Kalen's pulse quickened. The room was closing in, the exit cut off by the advancing group of figures, the distant sounds of movement growing louder with every passing second. He glanced at Tess, who was standing next to him, her expression a mixture of dread and defiance. She was scared, but there was fire in her eyes now. She wasn't backing down. "We fight," Kalen said, his voice low and steady. "We make it count." Rail's group spread out, taking their positions, each one a soldier in this grim battle. But Kalen couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. These people weren't just here to fight for supplies. There was a cold, deliberate malice behind their movements, like they had something to prove. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The first of the figures reached the middle of the warehouse, and Kalen's heart skipped a beat as he recognized their leader, a tall, wiry man with a scar running across his cheek, his eyes dark and calculating. He stopped at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over Rail's team. "Rail," the man said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "I didn't expect to find you here. Thought you'd have run by now. It's too late for that, though. You've crossed the line, haven't you?" Rail didn't flinch. His rifle was aimed steadily at the man, but his face remained unreadable. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you're not taking us alive." The scarred man smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "You think this is about taking you alive? You've already made your choice. You're part of the game now, whether you want to be or not." He nodded to the figures behind him, and they moved in tandem, surrounding Rail's group, cutting off their escape. Kalen's mind raced, but he wasn't about to let fear paralyze him. He had no idea who these people were, but their calm, calculated approach terrified him. These weren't the desperate souls who'd fought tooth and nail for survival, they were something else entirely. "Enough talk," Kalen muttered, his grip tightening on his revolver. With a sharp motion, Rail fired, the sound of the gunshot reverberating through the room. The scarred man ducked just in time, the bullet grazing the side of his face, but it was enough to set the others into motion. Chaos erupted. Kalen dove behind a pile of crates, firing shots as fast as he could, trying to keep the enemy pinned down. He heard the crack of Rail's rifle, the sharp thud of Margot's sniper shots, but it was the sound of fighting up close that made his stomach churn. The sickening squelch of metal tearing into flesh, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, the screams of men and women caught in the desperate frenzy of survival. But through the noise, there was one sound that made Kalen freeze, a low, guttural growl from the shadows. He turned just in time to see the first of the infected emerge from the darkened corners of the warehouse, their eyes glazed, their mouths snapping in hunger. "Damn it!" Kalen shouted. "They've brought infected." The scarred man didn't seem fazed. In fact, he smiled wider, his eyes glinting with something dark. "Not just infected," he said. "These are tools. A little reminder of how fragile you really are." The infected surged forward with terrifying speed, the growls mixing with the sounds of combat. Rail's group was now fighting on two fronts, human and infected, each battle more brutal than the last. Tess grabbed Kalen's arm, dragging him out of his stupor. "We need to move. Now," she shouted, her voice full of urgency. The room was spinning. The infected were closing in, their presence more terrifying with each passing second. Kalen could feel the weight of the situation pressing in from all sides. The only thing left to do was fight, harder, faster, smarter. Rail's voice cut through the madness. "Take them out. All of them." Kalen's mind snapped back into focus. He ran, weaving through the chaos, firing shots into the nearest infected. But there was no escape from this fight, not until it was over. The last stand of Rail's team, the last chance for survival in a world where death waited at every corner. And in that moment, Kalen knew one thing for sure, only one side would walk away from this battle. The warehouse had become an unforgiving battlefield. Screams and the clash of metal against flesh filled the air, a cacophony that drowned out all reason. Kalen's chest heaved as he fought his way through the mass of infected and surviving scavengers. Each movement felt like it might be his last. Tess was beside him, her face a grim mask of determination and terror. They were all fighting for their lives, but it felt like the world was closing in around them. There was no escape, at least, none that wouldn't cost them everything. Rail had been surrounded by infected. Kalen's mind flashed back to the moment when he'd seen his leader pinned to the floor, struggling to break free from their grasp. In the chaos, Kalen had reached out for him, but Rail had refused help. "Leave me." Rail's voice had been hoarse, filled with a strange kind of peace. "You don't understand. I'm done. But you can make it out." Rail's sacrifice, his willingness to give up, still burned in Kalen's mind like a raw wound. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Why hadn't Rail fought harder? Was it because he knew something the others didn't? Was Rail's acceptance of the end a kind of freedom? "No! We're not leaving you!" Kalen had shouted, but there had been no time for argument. Rail had made his decision, and Kalen knew deep down there would be no changing it. Rail's body had been taken quickly, swallowed up by the horde of infected that had surged forward like a wave crashing against a jagged rock. There was no dignity in the end. No nobility. Just death. It was the world they had come to know, a world where survival was the only currency, and humanity had become just another casualty of the plague. Kalen and Tess had fought their way to the exit, ignoring the screams of the others, the thud of bodies falling behind them. Every inch of progress felt hard-won, but with Rail gone, they had no time to mourn. The rest of the group had been swallowed by the chaos. They reached the warehouse door, pushing through the cracked metal as the last of the infected followed behind. The cold night air hit them with a shocking intensity, but it didn't bring the relief they had hoped for. They were alive, for now, but the world had already been destroyed. Tess leaned against the doorframe, her breath ragged. "We made it out," she said, more to herself than to Kalen. He nodded, though the words didn't quite sink in. His eyes scanned the horizon, the ruined city stretching out in front of them. Buildings stood like hollow shells, windows shattered, streets filled with debris. The remnants of a world that had once been vibrant and alive. A world now lost to the undead, to chaos, and to the despair of those left behind. "We're alive," Kalen repeated, but it felt hollow, as if saying the words made it less true. His gaze flickered back to the warehouse, where the sounds of the fight had already faded into the distance. It was over. Rail's last stand had been in vain, and with him went the last vestiges of leadership. The rest of the team was gone. Tess, still panting, wiped the blood from her forehead, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. But beneath the surface, there was something else, a flicker of something deeper, something stronger. "I don't know if I can keep going," she said quietly. "It feels like there's no point anymore. We've lost everything." Kalen didn't respond at first. He didn't have the answers. They had both lost so much. Rail, Troy, Margot, and the rest of the team, they were gone. The infected were still out there, relentless and unfeeling. But he couldn't let Tess fall apart now. Not when they were this close. "We keep going because that's all we have left," he said softly, more to convince himself than her. "We're still breathing, Tess. We're still alive." For a long moment, Tess didn't respond. But then, slowly, she stood up straighter, her gaze fixing on the empty streets ahead of them. "What now?" Kalen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question pressing on him. The world had fallen apart. There was nothing left to go back to, no shelter in sight, no hope for a future that didn't feel fragile and fleeting. Yet somehow, the fact that they were still standing, still breathing, meant something. There had to be something more than just surviving the next day. "We keep moving," he said finally. "We find what's left of the world, and if we can't find it, then we make something new. Together." Tess nodded, though the sorrow still lingered in her eyes. But there was something more now, something that wasn't there before. A sense of resolve. They had survived the impossible, and maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a new life from the ruins of the old world. Kalen stood by her side, staring out into the desolation, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been lost. But at the same time, there was a glimmer of something else, something that refused to be extinguished. Hope, in the form of a single heartbeat, still echoing in the dark. They weren't the only ones left. The world had fallen, but they were still breathing. And as long as they could draw breath, they would keep fighting.